So, today we're looking into a pretty surprising confession from Diddy that he made while in the hospital, and let me tell you, it's been all over the internet. You won't believe what he just told me. The first time I saw him in MDC, I thought it would be a different experience. I'm not sure, but it kind of feels like a guy strolling in as if he still owned the place, even with handcuffs on. Most celebrities, even the ones who have seen better days, often still hold on to a bit of that past life. It's pretty much all they've got left. So, this guy, he walked in quietly, avoiding eye contact, keeping his chin down, and without any show of bravado. Just a guy taking one step after another, head a bit down, going along with what he was told, like he understood the battle was already lost. Words travel quickly, just like they always do around here, and by the time he made it to the block, the whispers were already starting. MDC has certainly seen its fair share of famous faces, R. Kelly and Ghislaine Maxwell. There were a few politicians around, but this one just had a different vibe. Some folks saw him as a potential asset, a guy with cash and connections, maybe even a clout to get things done. Some people, on the other hand, viewed him as a liability, too much focus, too much pressure. It honestly didn't matter much what they thought. So, it seems like Diddy didn't really let them have a shot at testing him. He just stayed quiet, kept to himself, and didn't really make eye contact. At first, that kind of behavior definitely made people feel a little uneasy. I was thinking that maybe he was just being clever, trying to get a sense of the situation before he made his move. Days passed, and he still didn't show up. He wasn't out there searching for friends or trying to make a name for himself. In fact, he felt like he was blending into the background. I began to notice these small details, like how he would just sit on his bunk for ages, totally still, gazing at the wall, completely in his own head. Most new inmates either tried to catch some sleep to pass the time or ended up chatting a lot, looking for some sort of rhythm in all the chaos around them. He just sat there, like someone who was waiting for something he already knew was on its way. So, then the food showed up. The food here wasn't great, but when you're super hungry, you'll pretty much eat anything, even if it looks like it came off a tray. If your stomach's been growling for a while, you really don't have many options. He hardly touched his food at the beginning. People were joking around, wondering if he was just so accustomed to five-star meals that he couldn't deal with the prison food. Maybe he thought that if he just hung on a bit longer, his lawyers would come through with something better. But as the days passed, it became obvious that he wasn't just being choosy. His trays always came back looking pretty much the same, just a few bites missing really, but it always feels like it's just shy of being a complete meal. Sometimes he just moves the food around with his fork, never really eating it. Eventually, the jokes lose their charm because when a guy here stops eating, it's not typically due to a lack of hunger. There's usually something else going on. I could really see the weight loss. It wasn't just me who noticed how his face had thinned out in a way that felt a bit strange. His skin had this odd, ashy hue, and that jumpsuit that used to fit him so well was now just hanging off him like it belonged to someone else. In the yard, people were quietly chatting about it, wondering if he was unwell, but no one actually approached him to ask. So, that's when things began to shift during the night. About a week in, MDC found its own groove and medical runs weren't included in the late-night shift. If someone was feeling really unwell and needed assistance, they'd head to the infirmary when it's open. If it were serious, they would be transferred to a hospital outside. It wasn't really a calm situation, You'd totally hear about it. But with Diddy, they showed up at night. The first time I noticed, I really thought I might be dreaming. It was pretty late, and most folks on the block were already tucked in for the night. Then I woke up to the sound of boots in the hallway, those heavy footsteps. There wasn't just one guard. There were at least 3 of them moving slowly and with purpose. I didn't really think anything of it at first, but then I noticed they stopped at Diddy's cell. One of the guards went ahead and unlocked the door, while the others stayed back watching. Diddy was already awake, sitting up in his bunk like he had been expecting them, not groggy or confused at all. He just stood up, held out his hands for the cuffs, and let them take him out without asking questions or arguing. I saw them slip away down the hallway, taking their time and being super careful, almost like they were trying to avoid drawing any attention. But I did, and I wasn't alone in that. The next morning, Diddy was back on his bunk, just like he always was, as if nothing had gone down. But something just felt off. He reached for his cup, and his hands shook a bit. He seemed even more exhausted than earlier. It happened again. So, 2 nights later, and then again the night after that, by the 3rd time, I noticed something was off. The guards escorting him weren't the regular ones. Hey, those guys you see around every day, doing their thing? These were unique. One of them had a shaved head and was built like a tank, but his uniform just didn't seem to fit quite right. One of them had a face that looked way too clean and smooth for someone who had spent years in corrections. The 3rd guy hardly said a word. He just had his hand close to his belt, as if he was bracing for something to happen. They really didn't seem like your average guards, and the way they moved had this smooth, practiced vibe to it. I didn't mention anything to Torres or anyone else, but I just kept an eye on things. He never mentioned where they took him, not a single word about it, but I could tell it was really getting to him. Every time he returned, he seemed to look worse, his face more drawn, his steps more sluggish. It looked like his body was letting him down with the way he moved. Something was going on with him, and it wasn't just the prison wearing him down. So, one night I was feeling a little off when the guard showed up for Diddy. I stayed awake, acting like I was just moving around in my bunk. But honestly, I was keeping a close watch on everything. This time, when Diddy got up, his sleeve rolled back a bit, and I caught a glimpse of his wrist. There was this mark, dark and round, kind of like a fresh injection site. Seeing that made my stomach turn. They only took guys out at night for stuff they didn't want on the record. Whatever they were doing to Diddy, it wasn't just about keeping him locked up, there was something more to it, something even worse. I wasn't quite sure what it was at that moment, but I was set on figuring it out. I've always been a light sleeper. It's something I started doing pretty early in life. It was super useful in a spot like this, where the nighttime noises felt more like part of the experience than just background sounds. They really had a meaning to them. A shuffling footstep, the clink of cuffs, the quiet voices of guards chatting. Those were all signs, little warnings hidden in the everyday stuff. So, when I woke up that night and heard some movement outside my cell, my instincts kicked in even before my eyes were fully open. It was definitely not your usual night patrol. The steps felt way too controlled and way too purposeful. I moved a bit to catch a glimpse of the cell door, holding my breath as I looked through the reinforced glass window. A group of guards strolled down the corridor, but this wasn't your typical routine check. They weren't just making the rounds, they were here for a specific reason. And that reason was Diddy. Even though I had been waiting for this moment ever since I saw them take him the first time, it still felt a bit strange. I saw him step out of his cell, already in cuffs. He moved slowly but with purpose, like someone on a path he had to take. It wasn't Diddy that gave me the creeps, it was the guards. They were different from the usual MDC crew. I saw the regular night shift officers, the ones who usually keep to themselves and just clock in their hours like everyone else. But these guys, they were something else. They definitely had a unique vibe going on. Elle was super quiet. It seemed a bit stiff. They didn't say anything as they secured Diddy's cuffs and pushed him forward. There was just something about them that really gave off a vibe. It was beyond what you'd expect from regular prison security. The way they moved together, how they lined up in the hallway, and that one guy who just turned his head a little to sneak a peek at my cell, it all felt kind of off. I barely reacted. After all those years of practice, I learned that if you jump too fast, they'll catch on that you're paying attention. But when he glanced my way, it sent a chill right down my spine. It wasn't just a quick look. It felt more like a little inspection, like they were trying to figure out if anyone was really noticing. I held my breath, staying completely still as they strolled right by my cell. He just kept staring, not at me or anyone else, totally zoned out. He was just staring straight ahead, looking completely blank. That was the next thing that really didn't make sense. Medical runs always had a certain vibe, You could really sense the urgency in the air if an inmate was in real trouble. There would definitely be some chatting happening for the usual things. Even the guys faking injuries just to get out of their cells would still try to put on a bit of a performance. So, what about this guy? He just stood there, not pushing back, not asking anything, and he didn't even seem puzzled. He walked as if he had a clear idea of where they were headed, and to be honest, that really freaked me out more than anything else. When a guy stops wondering about his fate, it usually means one of two things. He's either come to terms with it or he realizes that pushing back won't make a difference. I just couldn't get to sleep after they left. I just lay there in the dark, replaying the scene over and over in my head, analyzing every little detail. It was strange how the guards didn't say anything at all, moving together like they were part of some routine. And Diddy just went along with it, which made everything feel way too controlled and planned out. I was just hanging out, waiting for the usual morning sounds to start, like an announcement or something that would shake up the routine. Honestly, I just want something that shows it was a typical day. But there really was nothing. A few hours later, I finally heard footsteps again. I got up and took my time, making sure not to draw any attention as I found my spot by the window. They were bringing him back. Diddy kept going, still with the same guys in uniform around him, but he looked like he was in worse shape now. His shoulders slumped, a clear sign of just how worn out he felt. His steps started to lose their sharpness and control, dragging a bit like his body was having a hard time keeping up with him. His hands were trembling in the cuffs. I could see it from my cell, that little uncontrollable shake. The guards were silent while they escorted him back to his bunk. No chatter, no reasons given, just a calm return as if everything was normal. I was thinking he might say something, how about you take a glance my way? He just plopped down, leaned back against the wall, and shut his eyes. He was breathing lightly, and his skin seemed even paler than it had been earlier. It seemed like something had gone down with him, and I could just sense he wasn't in the mood to share. That silence and acceptance really gave me a knot in my stomach. The next day, the rumors started to spread around. Word spread quickly around here. Even without talking to anyone, the walls seemed to share stories on their own. By lunchtime, everyone was buzzing about why Diddy had been taken out in the middle of the night. What's the official word? I've got a bit of a knee issue. So, I heard that he's been dealing with this for years. Apparently, he had a rough time during a marathon way back in the early 2000s, and now the pain is back, so he's looking to get an MRI. Some guys were totally on board with him, but I just wasn't buying it at all. So, a knee issue doesn't really add up to why he looked the way he did, right? And it's pretty strange that they took him away in the middle of the night with guards who weren't even part of the usual MDC crew. And you should have seen the look on his face when they brought him back. That really spoke volumes compared to any knee problem. I've watched plenty of guys come and go from medical runs, but none of them ever looked like that afterward. And none of them were being taken out repeatedly. I had a feeling this wasn't finished yet. I was just thinking about how much worse he'd look the next time they took him again. Prison runs on a schedule, but it really comes alive with the quiet chatter. It's pretty surprising how fast information can travel in a place where everyone is supposed to be cut off from the outside world. You don't really need the internet or news, just a good ear and a few clever questions will do the trick. Right now, everyone is buzzing about Diddy. The tension crept in early in the morning, slipping through the block like that bad, whether you can just feel in your bones before it actually hits. When we finally got to the chow hall for breakfast, the conversation had already shifted. It wasn't just the typical prison chatter anymore. It was all about who owed whom a favor and who had a run-in with the CO. Today, what was going on in the yard just didn't seem matter. Today was really focused on him. What did they do to him, dude? We settled down once more and were taken out again. So, last night was all about that medical checkup, right? But surely isn't dealing with knee injuries like that. Everyone seems to have their own take on it. Some of the younger guys felt like he was getting special treatment. They thought all this sneaking around was just evidence that the feds were giving him a deal. Honestly, he's got money. Do you really believe they'd just leave him stuck in here like the rest of us? One of them grumbled while looking at his tray. He's probably lounging in some fancy hospital wing, enjoying real food, and having a good laugh at all of us stuck here. The other seemed a bit uncertain about that. Nah, something's off, a guy named Luz said, shaking his head. He came back looking worse, not better. That's not how it goes when they do you favors. There was a pause as everyone realized that Luz had a point. If Diddy was being treated well, then why did he seem like he was on the edge of death? There was a moment of silence, and then finally, someone broke it by speaking up. Do you ever think about whether they're actually helping him? Everyone at the table turned to look at the guy who spoke. I only knew him by the name everyone used document. I had no idea what his real name was. He had been inside longer than most of us, probably in his mid-50s, and there was some gray starting to show at his beard. He wasn't one to talk a lot, but when he did speak up, folks really listened. That's because, before his time in prison, Doc had worked as a nurse. I saw a little spark of understanding among the folks at the table when someone asked, "What do you mean by that?" Doc took his time to respond, slowly taking a bite of his food, chewing, swallowing, and then leaning in a bit to lower his voice. Disker, I've seen this before," he murmured, as if thinking out loud. He paused, bringing up guys who quit eating. "So, you know how you sometimes notice someone losing weight really fast? It's not only about stress or unhealthy food choices. It feels like there's more beneath the surface. You know, like that guy who's obviously dealing with something that's really bothering him." Everyone at the table fell quiet, not only because of what he said, but also because of what he didn't say. There was this guy at the end of the bench who shifted in his seat, and you could just tell he totally got what was being hinted at. He didn't even have to complete his thought. The word hung there, weighty in the air, HIV. My stomach did a little flip. I wasn't really sure if it was true. None of us were, honestly, but in this place, a rumor like that could catch on quicker than the disease itself. And it was just about to. It all started with a fight in the cafeteria. It all started with these two guys from another unit. There was this big guy named Rico, and then a younger dude. At first, I wasn't really sure what was going on. It felt like just another argument, nothing too unusual. I was just hanging out when I heard Diddy's name pop up. I turned around just in time to catch Rico shoving the kid pretty hard, and his tray went flying right to the floor. "Repeat that, Rico," the younger guy said, wiping his mouth and shooting him a glare. I mentioned that I heard a CO say he has some sort of condition, they've been doing tests on him. Rico moved so fast that I could barely keep up. One moment he was just standing there, and the next he had the kid pinned against the table, his forearm pressing into his neck. "You have no idea," he said. The atmosphere in the room got really intense as the guards started to move in, ready to step in if needed. Just as they were getting close to the scene, the kid threw out one last remark. "Then why does he look like he's dying?" Rico took a step back, his fist still tight. The guard finally came through, grabbing both of them and pulling them in different directions. But you know what? It really didn't matter. The damage was already done. Everyone in that room caught wind of it. And in a place like this, that meant the whole prison was about to find out as well. When we finally got sent back to our units, it was the only thing anyone was chatting about. I strolled past 3 different groups, and there we were, chatting about it in hushed tones. So, it all clicked, didn't it? So, about the weight loss, did he have it before, or did he lose it while he was here? If he got it here, that means someone else had to be involved. No way, that's really how it went down. I decided to stay silent. I didn't want to make things worse. Honestly, I just couldn't shake this feeling that something was off. Diddy's condition was really concerning. He was fading away right in front of us, and now, we finally had a name for it, even if we weren't completely convinced it was the right choice. By nightfall, the word had traveled through every block, HIV. It had gone beyond a whisper. It was now a reality for the inmates. The next time they brought him out of his cell, all eyes would be on him. It wasn't only about what was wrong with him anymore, it was more about how he ended up that way. So, what about that question? That one was even riskier than the answer. At first, the change in Diddy was pretty subtle. If you weren't really focused, you might have thought he was just adjusting to the whole prison life scene. I've been keeping an eye on him from the very start, and honestly, it felt like more than just him getting used to things. It was something else altogether. He just stopped replying when folks tried to chat with him. Diddy had always kept to himself, not trying to be the center of attention or show off like some of the more flashy inmates did. At least he would give people a nod. If someone made a joke, he'd smirk, and if another inmate asked him something, he'd respond with a nod. That's all gone now. It was as if he completely tuned out whenever someone tried to talk to him. It wasn't disrespectful or dismissive at all. It was more like he was just totally somewhere else, completely disconnected. Even the guards saw it. They'd call out his name during head count, and he'd reply just a moment too late, almost as if he wasn't really there. They'd give his shoulder a little tap, and he'd jump like he was caught off guard by the touch. One of them even mumbled as he strolled by, saying the guys were checked out, and honestly, he wasn't wrong. Diddy spent a lot of his time on his bunk, just hanging out and staring at the wall. He wasn't reading, writing, or even pretending to sleep. He was just staring off into space. I've seen guys break in prison before. How time can really mess with a guy's head and make him start to unravel, but this was something else. This wasn't a guy falling apart. This was a guy just hanging on for a bit. There was something else as well. Something even worse. Diddy was always aware of what was happening around him. Most people here were. You really had to be. But recently, he started to notice something different. It wasn't just about keeping an eye out anymore. It seemed more like being scared. He noticed himself flinching at some things. The clank of a food tray, the echo of boots in hallway, and the sound of a door sliding open in the middle of the night would grab his attention. His eyes would flick toward the noise, and for a brief moment, there was something genuine in his expression. Not just caution or alertness, but a sense of recognition, like he was waiting for something or someone. One night, I happened to notice it when a certain guard strolled by. The guy was totally quiet, not even glancing at Diddy, but you could see Diddy's whole body getting tense. He tensed up, and his fingers gripped his jumpsuit tightly. He just stood there, silent and still, and for a split second, he seemed like a guy who had just seen a ghost. As soon as the guard left, Diddy let out a big breath and leaned forward, like all the stress just melted away. I wasn't quite sure what it meant, but I could sense it wasn't a good sign, and things just seemed to get worse at night. The block was never truly quiet. You could always hear voices floating through the cells, the odd cough, and the sound of guards shuffling around on their rounds. So, Diddy began waking up in the middle of the night, breathing quickly and with his eyes wide open. Initially, I figured it was just nightmares, plenty of guys experience them. But he wasn't tossing and turning or shouting out. He would just wake up, sit up in bed, and hang out like that for hours, breathing as if he had just sprinted a mile. So, one night, I caught him whispering to himself. I couldn't quite catch the words, but the tone said it all. It wasn't really anger or frustration. It felt more like something quieter, almost like resignation. He pretty much stopped eating altogether. At first, it looked like he was just being a bit fussy, pushing his tray away when it was one of the worst meals. But then it hit me that he wasn't just missing a few meals, he was completely steering clear of food. He would just take one bite and then leave everything else, even the water. The guard started off by trying to pressure him, throwing out warnings and insisting he eat or else he'd have to deal with the consequences. He didn't say anything, didn't argue or put up a fight. He just kept pushing his tray aside like it was no big deal. I noticed the weight loss pretty quickly. The prison food wasn't the best, but it did the job of keeping everyone from totally falling apart. But Diddy's face started to look a bit hollow, and his skin took on a dull grayish tone. His jumpsuit, which had fit him just right when he first got there, began to hang loosely with the fabric bunching up around his wrists. He moved more slowly, like each step was sapping the energy he just didn't have left. I had seen guys get sick before, flu, food poisoning, even withdrawals when they first came in, but this felt different. This wasn't a bug. It wasn't just a phase that would go away. It felt like seeing someone slowly decay from the inside out. One night, they showed up for him again. Here we go again with another late-night medical trip. Same guards, same quiet routine as always. I stayed up, just listening as their footsteps slowly disappeared down the hallway. Right before they rounded the corner, Diddy glanced up, his gaze meeting mine. They were completely empty, no fear, no resistance at all. Just give in. And for the first time since I got here, I felt a real sense of dread in the yard. Yard time was the only true escape from the heaviness of MDC. Even if it was just a piece of cracked concrete surrounded by razor wire, it felt like the closest thing to freedom. Hey, is anyone thinking about using this time to stretch a bit, shake off some of that restless energy, or maybe take care of some of that sneaky stuff they've been up to? But then there were those who just sat there, letting the minutes tick by, almost as if they were trying to forget where they were. Diddy was always the type of guy who never wasted a moment. Before prison, his life was all about being big, loud, and totally unstoppable. But now, things are different, and he's acting in a new way. It was like this dude was just strolling around with some invisible weights, you know what I mean? He took his steps slower, really thinking about each one. Remember that arrogance he used to show off? It disappeared, leaving a void in its place. As soon as he stepped into the yard, I sensed something was different. Everyone kept quiet and didn't want to say anything to him. Honestly, no one really looked at him for very long. It's funny how you'd expect him to draw some attention or at least make people wonder, but really he was just this guy that everyone seemed to avoid, like there was something a bit strange about him. I noticed him shuffling over to a bench against the far wall, his eyes fixed on the ground as if he were deep in thought. He was sitting there, kind of slouched forward with his elbows on his knees, looking like he was hardly even there. I paused for a second, then chose to stroll over to him. I wasn't really sure what it was. It could have been curiosity, or maybe something completely different. I plopped down on the bench next to him, making sure to leave a little space so it didn't feel too cramped at the start. He just sat there quietly and the silence hung in the air, but I chose not to say anything. I just sat there, soaking in the rest of the yard as it buzzed around us like a perfectly running machine. Inmates were hanging out playing cards and having quiet chats in little groups. The guards by the gate were standing there, looking pretty much like statues, with their hands just hanging out on their belts. Diddy exhaled slowly, his fingers gently tapping on his knee. In a voice so soft I almost didn't catch it, he said, "They didn't lock me up to punish me." I turned to him, frowning, and saw that his gaze was fixed on the ground, unfocused. "They might have put me here to keep me quiet." His tone was flat, not bitter or angry, almost like he had accepted something I didn't fully understand yet. I moved a bit on the bench, took a quick look at the guards, and then turned my attention back to him. "What on earth does that mean?" He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You ever think about why some folks just vanish?" A heavy feeling dropped in my stomach. You know how everyone has those stories they've heard, right? It's interesting how some powerful people can just disappear after a single misstep, isn't it? So, you know those celebrities who find themselves in situations that are just way too overwhelming? Some end up dead, and others just vanish without a trace. Diddy really made it seem like it was more than just a theory. I asked him whether he thought they were trying to make him vanish. He shook his head, a slight smirk almost appearing at the corner of his mouth. "Nah, they don't need me dead. They just need me gone." He turned to look at me, and his eyes were empty, not in a defeated way, but more like someone who knows too much. "You just don't understand," he said. "Sometimes they don't kill you. They just let you rot." That thought hit me hard, and I felt this heavy, sinking feeling in my chest. I really wanted to get to the bottom of things and find something concrete from him, but the way he talked gave me a moment of hesitation. He wasn't trying to be dramatic or fishing for sympathy. He was just stating it like it was already settled. Diddy let out a sigh and rubbed his hands together. "Have you ever heard the saying that dead men don't talk?" I nodded, and I could see his lip curl, almost like he was smiling but not quite. "That's the simple route, the fast one, but sometimes they just want you to chat a little." I frowned. "What does that even mean?" Diddy's eyes moved over to a group of guards loitering by the yard entrance. He tensed his shoulders, but his face stayed calm. "Let me show you just enough," he said softly. "Just enough to make it clear you don't mean a thing." Just as I was about to ask him something, a sharp whistle cut through the air, letting us know that yard time was over. Inmates started to gather by the doors in clusters, with some taking their time and others rushing back to their cells. I caught a glimpse of Diddy for a second. He was just there, looking at his hands, flexing his fingers, as if he was trying to see if they actually belonged to him. I was at a loss for words, and just when I thought about turning to leave, he chimed in again. "They're not going to let me leave here the same way. I came in." I just stood there, my mouth hanging open, but no words came to me. So, just like that, Diddy got up and headed inside, and I trailed a few steps behind, my mind going a mile a minute. I wasn't really sure what he was getting at, but one thing was clear. Diddy was no ordinary inmate doing his time. Whatever was happening with him, it surely wasn't included in the sentence. I had spent enough time in MDC to pick up on when things felt off, even with visitors who didn't have any labels. It wasn't always clear. There were times when the most unsettling moments happened without a sound. You know that silence that hangs around a little too long? It's like the air gets all thick and heavy. It's that kind of silence that really grabs your attention because deep down, you can just feel that something's off. That's the quiet. I woke up to the usual sounds of the block, snoring, coughing, and now and then, the shuffle of a restless inmate moving around on his cot. Everything felt there, but kind of toned down, almost like the prison itself. Wazing was just waiting in anticipation. I rolled onto my side, the bunk creaking a bit beneath me, and that's when I caught it. Footsteps. It's not the heavy, lazy stomp of Kosos on patrol, and it's definitely not the cautious shuffle of an inmate trying to sneak around at night. These were unique, thoughtful, and even a bit managed. I frowned and sat up, feeling my heart race a bit. Those footsteps definitely didn't fit in MDC. Wow, this place was just total chaos. Even at night, there was always some kind of chaos, something that felt off, but this? Wow, this is different. This was on a whole new level. I quietly got out of my bunk and headed over to the little reinforced window in my door. The hallway outside was kind of dim, with those cheap fluorescent bulbs flickering weakly above me. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, just the typical locked cells and some empty space. As the shadows stretched across the floor, I caught sight of them. 2 men. They really didn't look like inmates at all. Honestly, they seemed totally out of place. They were dressed in dark suits, sharp and polished, the sort you'd usually associate with courtrooms or corporate offices, not loitering around a federal prison at 2 in the morning. I could barely catch my breath while I saw them hanging out by Diddy's cell. Just no badges, no weapons, and no radios. So, you know what's really weird? The guards just let them pass without a second thought. The 2 guards hanging out down the hall didn't budge, no questions, no movement at all. They just stood there like statues, their faces blank, not tense or confused, just indifferent, as if this was all part of the usual routine. But this was anything but routine. I leaned in a bit more, trying to hear what one of the guys was saying. He spoke in a low voice, but it had a sharp edge to it. He's really close. There was a bit of a pause, but not just yet. I really didn't get what that meant, but the way he said it gave me a slow chill down my spine. So, without a second thought, they just opened Diddy's cell. No keys required. Guess what? There's no big announcement. It's just open. I took a breath, and he just went along with it. He just got up and walked out, almost as if he was expecting it, like he already had a clue. I really should have said something. I could have knocked on the door, whispered to the guy in the bunk below me, and asked if anyone else was noticing this mess. But I just didn't. I just stood there, hands on the door, watching them take him down the hallway. And just like that, they disappeared. No struggle, no sound, no trace left behind. I just froze there, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. So I ended up making the mistake of taking a quick look at the COs. One of them, the one nearest to my cell, was already looking straight at me. I caught my breath. His face was expressionless, neither giving me a heads up nor looking menacing, just staring. I took a step back, working to get rid of the lump in my throat. He just completely ignored me. He just turned his head back to the front, looking straight ahead as if nothing had happened. I stepped back from the door and hopped onto my bunk, trying to take slow, deep breaths. I'm not sure how long I just lay there, looking up at the ceiling, with my thoughts all over the place. What do they mean by saying he's close? Who were those people anyway? So, where were they taking him? I couldn't get any sleep after that. The morning rolled in, bringing along the same old routine. The COs went about their rounds as if everything was just fine, like nothing had happened the night before. When they got to Diddy's cell, they just walked right by it, not even pausing, as if it was just another vacant spot. I was up in my bunk, just watching everything unfold. It seemed like some of the other inmates picked up on it as well, because I began to hear whispers floating around the block. At first, it was pretty calm, but then things started to get lively. Hey, where's Diddy? Wasn't he around last night? I told everyone he wasn't coming back. Some guys just laughed it off, like it was no big deal, while others looked a bit more unsure. So, the official story came out pretty fast: medical transfer. That's what one of the COs mentioned when someone finally asked about it. Are you talking about a medical transfer? Oh, that definitely helped clear things up. But really, no one was going for it. Medical transfers aren't some kind of undercover operation. They don't go down in the middle of the night with people in suits and no paperwork in sight. By lunchtime, the chatter was already buzzing around. Some people said he was moved to a different prison, while others thought he might be making a deal with the feds. Some people even murmured that he had been completely removed, not just from MDC, but from the world entirely. But the most chilling theory, the one that really seemed to make sense, so, did he really never leave MDC at all? That thought felt even worse, because if he didn't leave, it meant he was still around somewhere. It was strange, really. No one was saying a word about it. Not the guards, not the warden, not even the COs who were supposed to be keeping an eye on things. And the guys who saw him every day in the yard, they were silent too. No one. That night, I was in my bunk, just staring at the ceiling, listening and waiting, but I didn't hear any footsteps, no hushed voices, nothing at all, just silence. The kind that really gave me the creeps, the kind that seemed like it would never go away. It got me thinking for the first time since I got locked up that some people really just vanish into thin air. Days passed, but that heavy, suffocating feeling that something was off just wouldn't go away. MDC has been feeling the impact ever since Diddy went missing. I've seen some really crazy things happen in here, like when fights get set up and the guards just look the other way while some poor guy is getting jumped in showers. But this was different. No one brought up his name anymore. It wasn't like how guys just seemed to fade away. It seemed like when they were sent to another facility or ended up in a SHU, it was on purpose. They didn't mention him at all, and even the usual chatterboxes who can't resist gossiping kept quiet. It wasn't really about respect. It was more about fear. I caught Torres looking my way a couple of times. My cellmate wasn't really the kind of guy to ask questions unless he thought it was important. But I could tell he felt that I was still thinking things through, that I wasn't quite ready to move on, that I was holding out for something, I just wasn't sure what it was. So, one morning, I just happened to come across it. It was early, and the block was still kind of groggy, with the usual sounds of guys moving around in their bunks, clearing their throats and mumbling to themselves. I swung my legs over the edge of my cot, feeling the chill of the floor under my feet as I rubbed the stiffness out of my neck. That's when I noticed it, a little bump under my mattress. Something just fell off. I stopped in my tracks, and my first thought was to look around me. Torres was still in his bunk, facing away. The guard seemed pretty distracted, and the CO by the gate was just leaning against the wall, lost in thought. No one was paying attention. I slowly reached under and pulled out a little folded piece of paper. I felt my heart racing, and I paused for a moment before I opened it. I had this feeling in my gut that this note wasn't just some random thing. I opened it up and ran my fingers over the creases, trying to smooth them out. The handwriting was pretty chaotic, messy, rushed, and all over the place, like someone just scribbled it down in a hurry. Just give me one sentence before I even got there. I kept going back to it again and again. There were just 2 more words at the bottom of the page. Diddy. I had this slow, sinking feeling creeping through my chest. I just sat there for what seemed like ages, completely still. I held the paper tightly in my fingers, just staring at the words, wishing they would magically rearrange into something that actually made sense. They gave it to me before I even got there. What on earth did that mean? Was he chatting about the disease? So, did he know about it before he got arrested, or was he implying that it was something they had done to him? He had something, something that got taken away when they put him in here. Or worse, was he implying that they had it all figured out from the start? I gulped, my throat feeling really dry. So many different possibilities were spinning around in my head, and honestly, none of them seemed great. So, I saw some movement happening. I barely had a chance to slip the paper into my waistband when Torres suddenly sat up in his bunk. His eyes were sharp and clearly focused, and it was obvious he'd been watching me. "You holding out on me?" he muttered. I tried to keep my expression calm. He looked down at my hands. He totally knew. "Come on, don't act like you don't know," he said, swinging his legs over the cot and leaning in, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've had something on your mind ever since he disappeared." I just didn't reply. He sighed, ran his hand down his face, and then spoke more softly. "Hey, listen, I don't need all the details, but if there's something crucial you want to say, now's the moment." I felt a little unsure. Torres wasn't just any old cellmate. He'd done time before. He understood the dynamics, knowing when to hold back, and when to push forward. I slowly pulled the folded paper out of my waistband and handed it to him. He grabbed it silently, taking his time to unfold it gently. I noticed his eyes moving over the writing, really focusing on his expression, the way his brow knitted together, and how his fingers gripped the edge just a bit more. Then, there was something else, a little spark of familiarity, as if he'd come across something like this in the past. He let out a quick breath through his nose and passed it back. "Hey, just so, this isn't the end of the line, right?" I didn't respond because I already had a feeling about it. For the rest of the day, that note just seemed to be burning a hole in my pocket. I felt a bit lost, unsure of how to handle it. I just couldn't throw it away. I couldn't take the chance of someone else stumbling upon it. But holding on to it forever, that looked like it could lead to some issues. As night fell, I finally came to a decision. I tore the paper into tiny pieces, even smaller than my fingernail, and flushed them down the toilet. If someone wanted me to get that message, I would have already seen it. Keeping that physical proof was definitely a recipe for trouble. Torres didn't say anything, but I could totally tell he was on board. We both ended up wide awake all night long. I was just lying in my bunk, looking up at the ceiling. I'd been mulling over those words that popped into my head. They gave it to me before I even got there. Was that a heads up? Is it a confession, a regret, or possibly something even more troubling? A note he left because he realized he wouldn't be coming back. I didn't really have an answer. All I knew was that Diddy was gone, and it felt like he was never meant to leave a message behind. The first thing that struck me when I woke up the next morning was how quiet it was. It wasn't the typical quiet you'd expect in a prison, right? It's not just the soft murmur of voices, the random clink of metal hitting metal, or the far-off sound of a guard's boots on the concrete. This felt different, like there was less going on. For days, there was this weird vibe in the air, something that nobody really wanted to bring up, but you could tell everyone felt it. It wasn't just that he was gone. It was the way they rushed to wipe away any trace of him, as if he had never existed in the first place. I figured they might just leave the space empty for a bit, maybe keep it vacant as a reminder, a warning, or even a statement. I messed up. So, by mid-morning, they had already brought in a new inmate, a young guy, just in his 20s, straight off the chain bus. He looked super confused, like he was totally lost and had no idea what was happening. The cot he just threw his sheets onto used to be owned by a billionaire not too long ago. It wasn't just the new body in the cell that gave me the creeps. The cleaning part was unsettling as well. The walls were scrubbed so hard they looked whiter than any other cell on the block, almost as if someone had bleached them. The bunk really should have had some signs of use, like creases in the mattress or the impression of a man's weight, but it looked totally untouched. There weren't even any of the small etchings around. Most of the inmates had been there for a while. You could see scratches on the wall and initials carved into the bed frame, along with tally marks that counted down the days gone by. It was as if Diddy had never shown up at all. It wasn't just me who noticed. Torres was right there beside me during chow, leaning against the wall and keeping an eye on the new guy as he poked at his food with that same vacant expression I had. I caught him mumbling, "They wiped it." No need for me to say anything. We were on the same page about what he meant. Prisons don't just clean cells like that unless there's something going on behind the scenes. What about him? He wasn't just your average inmate. He wasn't some random nobody. He was like a story, a headline that caught everyone's attention. But within these walls, it seemed like he was never really there. That's when the real gaslighting started happening. So, a couple of inmates began to ask some questions, just in a laid-back way, like, where's Combs? Did he get transferred? Did he end up in the SHU? But no one really got any answers. The ERS kept saying this one line over and over, almost like they were reading from a script. "You still here?" That was all there was to it. There are no details, no unit number, and no confirmation from anyone who has actually seen him. "He's still here." That response felt like a clear signal to stop asking anything else. If they had mentioned that he was transferred, someone might have checked the records. If they brought up that he was in the SHU, there's a chance someone would have perked up to hear his name during mail call. But he's still around, which just leaves us stuck. How can you even debate a statement like that? You really can't, and that's just what they were aiming for. But you know what's interesting about prison? It's not all about the official records. It's really more about the whispers that float around. What about those whispers? They just kept going. So, some folks were saying he didn't make it, that he passed away after that last medical trip. They left him to suffer for a while, letting whatever was gnawing at him from the inside do its thing. By the time they showed up for him, he was already too far gone to matter. People believe the paperwork showed he was transferred, but not to another prison, rather to somewhere completely different. There's this place that isn't officially on the map. Definitely not SHU, not ADX, and not even some secret section of MDC where he could just vanish without a trace. Some folks even thought the creepiest theory of all was that Diddy was never supposed to make it out alive. It wasn't about his crimes or justice, it was really about what he knew. Keeping him alive was the real challenge, and MDC felt more like a waiting room. Honestly, I wasn't really sure which theory I believed in, or if I even wanted to find out. I only knew that everyone out there still believed Diddy was in MDC. Everyone, the courts, the media, the lawyers, thought he was still stuck in that concrete cell, just waiting for his trial to start. But within these walls, in this prison, he was already gone. Torres and I didn't really chat about it much after that. What could I possibly say? We weren't clueless. We understood that we had witnessed a lot. The note, the eraser, and the way the guards all had that same blank stare. This definitely wasn't just a regular transfer. This was intentional. After that, I saw Torres being a bit more careful with what he said. He spoke softly when others were nearby and kept his head down. I went along with what he was doing because, to be real, it didn't really matter if Diddy was still around or if they had just left him behind somewhere. In the end, it was just like before. He was gone. And if we keep digging, we could end up in the same spot. So one night a few weeks later, I heard Torres mumbling while we were lying in our bunks. At first, I figured he was just mumbling in his sleep, but then he repeated it, calm and steady, as if something was dawning on him. I turned my head a bit and let out a breath through my nose, wondering if he was right. I just didn't reply. There was no need for it. I got what he was saying. What if they were just trying to help him instead? What if they were just biding their time until he passed away? That thought lingered in the air between us, thick and unvoiced. For the first time since all this started, I really didn't want to find out the answer.